Hey there, and welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and this is episode 136, The Prodigal Son and the Christian Mystic. It is great to be back with you again as we continue our journey into Season 7, which is entitled Deep Calls to Deep. Now, if you're new to the Soil and Roots podcast, we always recommend starting at the beginning. All of our content is evergreen. There's nothing related to current events, so you're not missing anything if you take a slow and measured journey through the last 7 seasons. Season 1 outlined the problem that Soil and Roots exists to help resolve, which is the great omission. Modern Christianity talks about making disciples, but actually struggles to help form them. Seasons 2 through 4 outline 3 obstacles or problems in our spiritual journeys today: the discipleship dilemma, the formation gap, and the forgotten kingdom. And then in Season 5, we took our breath a little bit, and we enjoyed several really good conversations with outside professionals and theologians and thinkers as we explored the great omission together. And then in Season 6, we decided to spend our time exploring the object of our formation. If spiritual formation is about us becoming more like Jesus from the inside out, so that we think like he thinks and act like he acts and relates like he relates and loves like he loves, what exactly does that look like? What is the object of our formation? Who is the object of our formation? And we spent some time exploring him in some ways that are a little bit non-traditional. Now, here in Season 7, Deep Calls to Deep, we are finally answering the how question. How is it that we become more like Jesus over time? You know, this phrase, deep calls to deep, we've said it a number of times throughout the last 4 years of providing podcasts to you, but it's actually not a particularly well-known phrase. In fact, it only occurs in the Bible one time, and that's in Psalm 42:7. I'll recite it for you. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and breakers have swept over me. You might wonder why I chose that phrase and verse as the theme of this season, because it's not a particularly peaceful passage. Waves and breakers sweeping over us doesn't seem to connect very well with what we're exploring this season, which we call the good life. Well, stay tuned, because we're going to see how those dots eventually connect. Believe it or not, our very first episode was launched in May of 2022. So it's been about 4 years, and we're finally exploring this how question. How do we become people of depth? Harkening back to the book that we explored a few years ago, The Critical Journey, how do we become stage 6 followers of Jesus? People who naturally and even unconsciously think and act and relate and loves like Jesus does. Doesn't that sound amazing? It sounds pretty cool. How do we become more attuned? How do we become more attuned to God and others and even ourselves? How do we become less anxious and less fearful, more relationally secure, more willing to give ourselves away? What some authors call holy indifference. The Holy Spirit, of course, is the one who guides us into and through this journey of spiritual formation. But as we've discussed, we need to intend to join him and come along for that ride. We have talked at length about the obstacles to our discipleship, and that exploration has been worthwhile. Becoming increasingly aware of both the helpful and harmful ideas that form our cultures and churches is essential in our quest for depth, and I hope that that's been helpful to you. And we've covered a lot of ground throughout the last 4 years of podcasts. The Great Omission, like I said, Christian fatalism, a very powerful idea in our modern era, the impact of our families of origin, and our early stories on our spiritual journey, the negative aspects of Christian institutionalism, the downsides of Western culture and technology, a modern hyper-emphasis on instruction, and the harmful downplaying of relationships and experience in favor of that instruction. Remember, modern Christianity still primarily functions from the Enlightenment idea that I think, therefore I am. But the kingdom's perspective is very different. I am loved, therefore I am. Discipleship is not just about what we mentally accept. It is about who we are becoming. A life apprenticing with Jesus is primarily about the ongoing formation of our inner life. Back in episode 134, I outlined the entire Restore the Word's journey in 3 phases or categories. And the first category is what we're exploring this season, the good life. This is the type of inner life that the Bible seems to invite everyone into. It's the life of a daily, intimate, secure relational attachment to God. There are verses abounding throughout the Bible that describe this type of life, and I'll just share a couple snippets of a few of them. In John 15, abide in me and I in you. John 14, we will come to them and make our home with them. Matthew 11, you will find rest for your souls. Philippians 4, the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds. John 17:3, the definition of eternal life, that we may know God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent. In Romans 8, there is no condemnation. 1 John 4, perfect love casts out fear. 2 Corinthians 3, we are being transformed from glory to glory into the image of the Son. Acts 17, in him we live and move and have our being. Ephesians 3, that we may know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. Listen to some of those key words: abiding, resting, home, peacefulness, knowing God intimately, no condemnation, the casting out of fear, being transformed, living in him. We know love beyond knowledge. These are extraordinary terms that I'm not sure how much time we spend meditating on or expecting that they become our day-to-day reality. It's the good life, the with God life, a life characterized by love because we live in the experience of that love. As we've noted before, this type of life is also called Christian mysticism. Christian mystic is simply someone who is formed by an experiential union with God, in the same way that a husband and wife are often formed like each other experientially over time. And we've concluded that Christian mysticism should actually be the norm for those who follow Jesus. But is that actually the case? Well, you know how much I love data, so I went and did some digging to see if I could find some modern answers to that question. According to the Barna Group, among people who identify as Christian, 20% engage in daily prayer, 10% report feeling deeply connected to God, and somewhere between 5 and 8% indicate some integrated, spiritually formative inner life. I did combine Barna with a few other research studies, and the estimates came out as follows. In general, of those who profess to follow Christ, somewhere between 20 and 25% of those people believe that God is actually relational. Among 15% of those people experience God occasionally, 5 to 8% live with a regular awareness of God's presence, and somewhere between 2 and 5% live something resembling what we're describing, the with God life or the good life. So even if that estimate is rough, it's even close to being accurate, we can easily conclude that the New Testament assumes a way of life that only a very small percentage of modern Christians actually experience. That's worth repeating. The teachings of Jesus and other writers point to a way of life that only a few of his followers actually experience. So the data raises an obvious question. If the Bible promises an abundant, relationally secure, peace-infused life that exudes unity and wisdom, relational shrewdness, love, why may you and I not be experiencing it? Well, one reason I mentioned briefly is that the vision for this type of life is rarely taught. Remember, we remain in a version of Christianity that prioritizes getting saved and getting educated over inner formation. And we could spend an entire season exploring how the modern institutional church does or does not help us into those waters. Yet there are additional, I think, deeper reasons why so few of us live in the reality of the good life, and they center on our struggle to be vulnerable. The good life requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is a formation-intensive, not an information-intensive journey. We live and operate from what we love and fear, not from what we intellectually affirm. Remember our David Benner quote, Genuine transformation requires vulnerability. It is not the fact of being loved unconditionally that's life-changing. It is the risky experience of allowing myself to be loved unconditionally. End quote. Yet, as we've admitted, we struggle to be vulnerable. To receive God's unabashed, transformative, unconditional love is not as easy as we might assume. So let's explore a few reasons why vulnerability may be such an obstacle for us, even if we desperately long to live this good life. Okay, so to do this, I'm going to go way back into the archives and remind us of the concept of ideas. This was a really prominent theme in seasons 1 through 4. An idea is a conclusion or an assumption or a principle in which our hearts are rooted, but of which we're not typically aware. They're not so much intellectual agreements as they are experienced realities. So if you've been around soil and roots for any length of time, you should be familiar with this concept. Again, if it's new to you, I do suggest going back and at least listening to season 1. Most of these ideas in our hearts are formed through relationships and experiences, particularly in our early years. Remember, the name soil and roots is actually built around this concept of ideas. Our hearts are our roots, and the soil is the system of ideas in which our hearts are rooted. Our soil is the formative relationships and experiences in our lives with God and others and ourselves and even creation and culture. Okay, so way back when, I suggested to you that there are 6 core ideas, these unconscious assumptions, that influence our hearts more than any other. Here they are. Ideas of identity, anthropology, value, power, purpose, and love. In other words, who am I? What am I? What am I worth? What authority do I have? Why am I here? And what do I truly desire? How our hearts, and not our heads, how our hearts answer these questions reveals where we truly are on our discipleship journeys. Again, these 6 core ideas are not normally processed consciously. Our ideas are like our operating systems. They work in the background, and we aren't usually aware that they're running. Okay, I know we're going pretty deep here, but just stick with me for a second. I'm going to submit there are at least 4 obstacles to receiving God's love with vulnerability and entering into the good life, and we're going to map those 4 obstacles onto these core ideas. Okay, the first obstacle that is very common for us receiving God's love with vulnerability, even if we're following Jesus, even if we've made a profession of faith, is our need for control, which relates to ideas of power. Who is really in charge? The second obstacle is our avoidance of pain. The path to the good life normally involves some pain and suffering. It's basically inevitable. This obstacle relates primarily to our ideas about anthropology. What does it mean to be human? We assume, especially in our modern age, that pain is something to eliminate or numb rather than a place where God meets us. The third obstacle to receiving God's love with vulnerability and entering into the good life is that feeling we're not worthy of receiving God's love. I'm too broken for him. These are internal messages of shame and relate primarily to our ideas of value. What are we really worth? The fourth obstacle is a mistrust of God's character. I'm not sure God is actually safe or really good. This maps primarily to ideas of identity. Who is God really? And who am I to God really? All right, let's put a little flesh on this. Imagine a young child playing outside, running around, completely free, having a great time, when they trip and fall. And it's a decent, real fall. Skin scraped, maybe some blood, definitely shaken. A loving parent is but nearby and sees it and immediately moves towards the child. Their arms are open and they're ready to help. But instead of running toward the parent, the child hesitates, maybe even pulls back. And it's not because the parent isn't loving, it's because in that moment, the crisis causes the child to function from her base operating system, from her core ideas. So if she stops, if she lets herself be held and comforted, the pain and the fear will come rushing to the surface all at once, and they don't yet know how to handle that. There's also an early sense of, I want to do this myself. It's not necessarily rebellion, it's just self-protection. And somewhere along the way, she's already learned not to cry too much, not to make a scene, not to be a problem. So the child wipes away the tears and says, I'm fine, even though they're clearly not. So what's happening in that moment tells us a lot about why receiving God's love and vulnerability is so difficult for us. First, there's control. For the child, it shows up as self-reliance. I'll handle this myself. For us, that instinct matures into the belief that safety comes from staying in charge. That might be the key phrase of the entire episode. For us, that instinct matures into the belief that safety comes from us staying in control. Vulnerability, receiving God's love and vulnerability, feels risky because it means relinquishing that grip. We typically don't like it when our ideas of power are challenged. Second, in our story of the child and her falling, there's pain avoidance. The child senses that accepting care will mean feeling everything all at once, and so do we. We assume pain is something to outrun, to numb, to explain away, especially having grown up in cultures where pain has been positioned as something universally bad or even unnatural. But anthropologically speaking, pain is inevitable. It's not that we face pain that defines us, it's how we move through it and with whom. Third, there's the sense of shame and unworthiness messages that are constantly running around some of our brains. Even early on, the message is learned, don't be a problem. Don't need too much, don't fall apart. And over time, that becomes the quiet belief that we are too broken, too needy, or simply too much to love. So we quietly question our value. And finally, tying this into our story, there's a mistrust of love itself. The child isn't questioning whether the parent exists, but whether comfort will actually help or somehow make things worse. Many of us relate to God the same way. We believe he's real, even loving in theory, but we're not quite sure he's safe enough to entrust our full selves to. So we say, I'm fine, and remain guarded, missing the very love that could heal us. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, we respond to God's constant invitations like this unconsciously. That is, until we do the hard work of uncovering our genuine ideas. Now, we actually find the same 4 obstacles to receiving God's love vulnerably and entering into the good life in perhaps what is the most famous parable of all time, the parable of the prodigal son. I won't go through the entire story, as I'm pretty sure you're familiar with it. But it does give a fascinating look at these 4 obstacles, how they're challenged by suffering, and how the younger son's ideas change when he returns home. His father's love transforms the son's 4 obstacles. All right, so very quickly, at the beginning of the story, what are the son's ideas about power? Well, he brazenly asks for his inheritance before his father dies, so it's obvious he functions from the assumption that he has more authority than his dad and maybe anybody else. What about anthropology? What does the son assume about his pain as a human being? Chances are when the story starts, he hasn't dealt with too much of it, or if he has, it's been in the safety and security of being at home. How about value? What are his ideas of value? To put it bluntly, he finds himself more valuable than his father and his brother and whatever other family was around. What about his identity? It's clear that he functions from the idea that he belongs to himself. He rejects his father and his family, perfectly happy to run his own life as he sees fit. But let's remember, God's customary invitation for us to enter the good life, to live the with God life, to become a Christian mystic, is suffering. What is the son's response when he encounters pain? Well, in this case, he awakens, or in Soil and Roots lingo, he becomes more attuned to himself and to his father. He becomes aware of his unconscious ideas. Well, what happens to his 4 obstacles? Because he presses into the suffering, his 4 ideas change. His heart realizes he actually has very little power. He finds pain not something to numb, but something to experience with others. His ideas of value do a 180. He no longer views himself as too valuable, but rather not valuable enough. And his ideas of identity go through a radical shift. He is willing to give up his sonship, his familial inheritance, just to be back in communion with his father. The most beautiful part of the story is, of course, the end, because the younger son actually shows us how to enter the good life. We watch him become a Christian mystic, if you will, someone who dwells in the experiential love of his father. So the son comes home, his father sees him from a long way off, runs to meet him and embrace him, and the son begins his prepared self-deprecating speech. But the father will have none of it. He interrupts him and instead demands that the whole household throw him a party. The father gives him valuable gifts and brings him back into the house, simply overjoyed that his son has returned. As much as this parable has been taught and taught and taught, what is rarely discussed is actually the son's response once the father ignores his speech. What does the son do? We know the father offers him unconditional love, but the son receives the father's unconditional love with vulnerability. Have you ever thought about how you would respond if you were the younger son and your father treated you like this? I could imagine myself insisting that the father treat me as a servant, not a son. I may have insisted that I finish my speech, so sorry and sad that I had squandered my inheritance, so embarrassed by my behavior that I would simply demand that I needed to earn my way back into the family. Either I would be his servant or I simply wouldn't come inside the house. Doesn't that sound honorable? I could refuse to go to the party, having concluded that I simply didn't deserve the love of my father. I can conclude that I was once too good for him and now I'm simply too bad for him. Perhaps I could simply envision myself running away, so overwhelmed by the father's radical and surprising response that I just can't take it. Such forgiveness, such generosity, such mercy and grace is just too much, and so I just leave the scene. But happily, that isn't how the younger son responds. We don't know much from the way Jesus told the story, but the son obviously stops talking. He receives the father's embrace and allows himself to be celebrated. He happily re-enters the father's house where his father is in control. That's the idea of power. He allows the father to heal his pain simply by being with him. He accepts the value that his father bestows on him, and he rests in his identity as his son. The younger son becomes a Christian mystic. He allows himself to be loved as his father intends, and the result is a secure relational attachment, transformed ideas of power and value and anthropology and identity, and he vulnerably receives the somewhat reckless, prodigal love of his dad. Someone recently asked me what was different about Soil and Roots. Why did we even exist when discipleship is such a ubiquitous term and there's a bazillion discipleship organizations all around the world? Well, my first response is that we explore discipleship anthropologically, not just theologically. The central question we ask here is, how does one person become more like another person from the inside out? If the discipleship journey is to become more like Jesus as a tract of inner formation, how does that actually happen? The process of inner formation or character formation, that is ultimately an anthropological question. Tied to that is my second response. Soil and Roots explores what it means to disciple the unconscious self. If in fact we are governed and powered by these ideas and desires that we don't normally pay attention to, what if we did? If the point is to naturally, organically, effortlessly think, act, relate, and love more like Jesus over time, then that transformation needs to influence both our conscious and our unconscious selves. And as we've noted a few times, the unconscious parts of our hearts are primarily shaped by relationships and experiences, not by intellectual arguments. And again, this is precisely what we find in the prodigal son. The son's unconscious inner life is not changed by arguments or facts. Those are essential to the Christian life, but they are not particularly formative. What transforms the son's inner life is the radical relationship and the experience of the love of his father. And the son can only experience his father when he surrenders in vulnerability to his extravagant love. As it turns out, this type of vulnerability is not a one-time event. For most of us, it's just a way of life that we gradually surrender to and experience over time. All right, so some key takeaways for today. Do we really believe that the good life is what God has for us? Or are we in the 95% plus of modern day Christians who don't experience this with God life? Even deeper, do we want to be transformed into Christian mystics? That is, in fact, a very challenging question. How challenging is it for us to receive God's love with vulnerability? Do we really want to surrender and give up our ideas of power, of value, of anthropology, of identity? I've tried to make the case to you that becoming a deep disciple depends on our knowing both Jesus and ourselves better. It's this concept of double knowledge. I'm not sure I can make a better case for knowing ourselves in today's episode. Perhaps the base reason why so many of us don't experience the good life is that we'd rather not get to know either one of us particularly well. As C.S. Lewis famously quipped, we are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. Thanks so much for being with me today. For more information, as always, you can check us out at sorlandroots.org. That's sorlandroots.org. If you're on social media, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Sorrel and Roots Podcast, and on YouTube and Substack at just Sorrel and Roots. Today's episode was written by Brian Fisher and is produced by Zach Fisher, and we're happy to bring it to you. Episode 137 is coming up next. We'll be back in the greenhouse with handsome Kyle and Doc, and I can't wait for you to join us. We'll see you next time.